Welcome everyone to a very special event hosted by the Hawaiian Islands Association for Marriage and Family Therapy. And today we are so grateful to be able to host an internationally renowned author, speaker, academic, Dr. Scott Miller. Scott is so humble that when I asked him for some sort of a tee-up, he said, let's just tell a story, which I just love. What I find near and dear to my heart when I think of the story of Scott Miller is first learning about Scott and his work many years ago in graduate school about the common factors of positive outcomes in psychotherapy. And so over the years, I've just continued to follow Scott and his team's work as it's evolved. And now his upcoming book is called Better Results, Using Deliberate Practice to Improve Your Therapeutic Effectiveness. And so if you want to get good and help clients achieve their best in clinical practice, Scott has some really concrete steps you can take to do that. So speaking of his book that's coming out on May 26th from the American Psychological Association Press, you can pre-order that book on Amazon, and if you do, and email Scott, he and his team will be willing to send you some chapters early so you can get a jump start on reading that book before everyone else in the world. Scott, mahalo for your generosity.
So, hey, John, I really appreciate the opportunity to connect with everybody on the islands and talk about deliberate practice. Hope to make this lunch hour that we spend together helpful and useful. All of the information I'm going to be talking about today, you can actually find on my personal website. That is at scottdmiller.com. Have to have the D in between Scott and Miller. And if you go to the website and you take your cursor and click on the About tab, another box will open up. Says Publications. Click on that tab and you'll be taken to a page where you can download these particular pictures and slides, and in fact all the publications and research that we are using to support this particular presentation. So I'm also part of a group called the International Center for Clinical Excellence, and when I say international, I really mean that. We have members all over the world. It doesn't cost anything to join. It's really like a mixture of YouTube and Facebook for clinicians. You can go there, you can ask questions of the community. Always there's somebody up and awake and willing to answer. You can always email me. I do answer all of my own email. Just send that email to info@scottdmiller.com. If you don't get a response from me within 48 hours, probably means you forgot to put the D in between Scott and Miller. So info@scottdmiller.com. I hope you'll join us in the community to chat about the ideas I'll be talking about today. This may look like downtown Honolulu, but it isn't. It's actually downtown Chicago. I took this picture myself from the 95th floor of the John Hancock building. We're looking north up the Lakeshore Drive. If you've ever been to Chicago, Lake Michigan to the east in this particular picture is huge. It's giant. You can't see the other side. Looks like an ocean, but I will tell you from personal experience, while some do try to surf on this lake, the surfing is not very good, actually. And most weeks during the regular part of the year when we're not experiencing the kind of outbreak that we have from COVID-19, what I'm doing is flying somewhere and talking to various kinds of mental health behavioral health professionals, therapists of all disciplines, administrators of clinics and agencies, both public and private, researchers, the people who pay for services, and business executives, and of course the all-important regulators, the people who pass the rules about the work that we actually do. From the time I was a beginning therapist, had a singular objective, and that was I wanted to get better at what I did. For my entire career, I've been what I would call an anxious clinician. Things that my fellow graduate students seem to understand very quickly. Just like that, if the professor talked about a model or an idea, they understood it. I struggle, and I still struggle to really listen to the people that I'm working with. This isn't some feigned kind of humility here. It's the truth. Oftentimes I'm sitting opposite another human being and really wondering, what is it that I have to offer, and how possibly can I be helpful? Or in the event I find I'm not, what else can I do? And so the question that many of the people that I interact with is very much the same. Are we actually helpful as clinicians? And if we're going to have a presentation on better results, you have to first know how effective you actually are. And so let's take a look and answer that particular question. How effective are we as clinicians? And here the data is actually, I think, pretty rewarding. The data say that in most studies of psychological treatments conducted over the last 40 years, the average treated person is better off than 80% of the untreated sample. Now, I want you to know what I didn't say. I didn't say we were successful with 80% of the people we meet with. This is the strange, rarefied way that researchers speak to one another. Researchers are always comparing a treated group against an untreated group. So if we had a whole room full of untreated people with the same problems or concerns, the one person who got care would be better off than 80% of those people in terms of their well-being or their symptoms. So what we do really does work. In fact, the outcome of behavioral health services equals, and in most cases exceeds, most medical treatments. Let me tell you that the effect size, that's how we estimate how big of an impact a treatment has, of psychological treatments, any kind that's been tested, applied to any particular problem or concern, is equivalent to coronary artery bypass surgery. It's 4 times greater than the effect size of fluoride in the prevention of dental caries. So one more time, when we're thinking generally about psychological treatments, whether we're working with individuals or couples, families or children, the data say what you do on a day-to-day basis with your clients is really quite helpful. And let's take a look at that. Exactly how effective are the average mental health professionals? And when we look at your effectiveness, and believe me, our team has been responsible for measuring the outcomes of thousands and thousands of practitioners around the world. On average, your outcomes are on par with success rates seen in randomized controlled clinical trials. Now take a minute and let that sink in. What that means is that randomized controlled trials, which are the ones that agencies use in the government to identify which treatments are evidence-based, your outcomes are already at that level. It's pretty amazing. So we are effective, and that makes the challenge of getting better, I think, even more difficult. Here is the other issue. Over the last 44 years, since actually about 1976, there has been no improvement in treatment outcomes. Now, remember, I've said we're pretty good at what we do. The problem is we haven't really improved. Now, I know you might be thinking, haven't we improved access? Haven't we shortened the length of care? Isn't our treatment better for this particular population? And the data really say, no, we're not. We're not more effective. And I imagine you might be thinking, how could that be? We're going to go there in just a minute. In the meantime, let's take a look at another field in terms of human performance, and that is Olympic athletes. Over the last century, the best performance for every single Olympic event, every single one, that includes the beer stein carrying competition, has improved, in some cases by more than 50%. And in fact, today's best high school running time in the marathon beats the 1908 gold medal winning time by more than 20 minutes. That improvement, by the way, has nothing to do with the size, genetic changes, technology, or performance enhancing drugs. Simply put, our athletes have managed to get steadily better year after year in terms of their performance. Let me show you a picture of somebody. Maybe you've heard of her. Take a moment. If you don't know who this is, her name is Jeannie Rice. And Jeannie Rice is a runner who is 70 years old, and she beat the 1965 gold medal winning time in the marathon by more than 3 minutes. Amazing. Especially if you compare it to us, where there's been absolutely no improvement. Don't get discouraged. Remember, we've started really at a good level. Our average outcomes on par with most of medicine, but we're just not getting better at our treatment outcomes. Let me show you another picture. This is taken from a colleague of mine, Anders Ericsson, who we'll refer to shortly. These are pictures of ballerinas holding two different positions. We're just going to look at the first one, the arabesque. It's the most common. If you took ballet lessons as a child, you probably practiced this endlessly. And these pictures go from the 1960s up past the change of the millennium. Look at the picture up in the upper left-hand corner, 1962, and look at the leg extension in this ballerina who is doing the arabesque. And then notice what happens over time. Almost in a linear fashion, her leg extension improves so that by 2003, it's perpendicular to the floor. That is an amazing improvement, and that is the new standard. I mention this particular picture because 1962 was a watershed year in mental health. If you recall, John Kennedy was president, and he passed the Community Mental Health Services Organization Act in that same year. So we've been around at the same time, except for us, our outcomes have not, they just haven't gotten better. And this was my big challenge as a student. I believed that the professors had some unique knowledge, that if they gave it to me, if I went to the continuing education workshop, I learned a particular technique for that particular problem, that my outcomes would improve. Step back from this as a researcher and look dispassionately at the data, and we find very little evidence to be sanguine about our results. Do therapists want to improve? Well, you're on this phone call, you must want to improve, and you're just like I am as well, hungry for new information. And in fact, the data say that therapists do want to improve. This is some work that was done by one of my heroes in the field, David Orlinsky, and a Norwegian psychologist by the name of Mikael Runnestad. It's the largest study and most comprehensive study in the history of psychotherapy with regard to professional development. 20-year, multinational, 11,000 therapists. They collected and analyzed very detailed reports about the way therapists experience their work. You can find summaries of this volume online, or you can actually read the book, which is also quite interesting, How Psychotherapists Develop. What did they find after their study? They found what I told you. They found what's in your heart and what's been in mine since the beginning of my career. The majority of therapists see themselves as developing professionally over the course of their careers. Now think about yourself. This really isn't that hard to believe. If you think back to your very first client, I can actually remember the name of my very first practicum client, not a fellow student, not somebody I was role playing with, but actually a human being on the opposite side of the room who was suffering. And I certainly see myself as more skilled and able than I did at that particular time, almost 35 years ago now. But the question is, does our vision of ourselves match reality? Are you ready for some kind of bad news? Here we go. What the data say is that the effectiveness of the average helping professional plateaus rather early in their career. How early? Well, take a moment. Let a number pop in your head. When I do this at workshops and ask people, how long was it until your growth and effectiveness begin to plateau? Again, might not be exactly flat, but really started to decrease in terms of growth. When was it? Usually when I ask this, as I say, most people say 2 to 5 years. The answer is about 50 hours of direct clinical service. In other words, we can't, as researchers, find much evidence that therapists improve their effectiveness after 50 hours of training. And in fact, we can't seem to find much difference in outcome between professionals, that is, people like me, post 5-year training and a PhD in psychology, between us and our students and most paraprofessionals. This, I hope, doesn't make you feel bad, but lights a fire underneath you, wondering, well, what is it we can do? Because we go to all the workshops, we try hard, we reflect on our work, we try to listen to feedback, etc. What does it actually take to improve the way Olympic athletes improve? Hold on to that, because that's a particular clue. In the meantime, let me show you what is the largest study of the impact of experience on outcome of therapists conducted in the history of psychotherapy outcome research. This is a little study that I did together with colleagues Simon Goldberg and others, appeared in 2016. What we did was we followed 170 therapists for up to 17 years. The key was we measured their outcomes at each and every session with their clients. And then we looked at what happened over time. And it can be a little difficult to see in this scatter plot, but if you take a look at that red arrow, it indicates that over time, therapist outcomes actually slowly decline. They don't drop off a cliff right after you leave school, but they deteriorate slowly, sort of like the sound of the air when you let the air out of a balloon. It's a slow, inexorable leak. One other thing we found in the study that I think is quite interesting is that something a quality therapist had actually did increase over time. Take a moment, see if you can guess what that might be. Outcomes are slowly declining. What possibly could go up? Well, here's the bad news: confidence. As our outcomes decline, our confidence level goes up. And in looking and talking with the therapists who report this phenomenon, most of them actually equate their smoothness with their confidence. They're not hemming and hawing in the room with clients. Ideas come to them much more quickly than they did when they were first working. That, in the expertise literature, is called automaticity. We're going to come back to that later. It's a double-edged sword. The more experience you have, the less you actually have to think about what you're doing. The problem is, the less you think about what you're doing, the less you reflect on it, the greater the chance that you are not learning anything new in the process. Again, we'll come back to that in a minute. Do therapists develop? The evidence is not entirely positive. Do we want to develop? Well, again, as I say, here you are on this call, and I talk to thousands of therapists during the year when I'm usually on planes flying to different locations. And it's part of what keeps me in the field. It keeps me engaged talking to clinicians. They are honestly, there's always a bad apple in the group, but for the most part, they inspire me with their dedication to their clients and their interest in absorbing any new information that might improve their work. So I don't think this question could be possibly answered no. But the question that might be important is, if you ask therapists what they think they need to learn in order to improve, you might get some interesting results. And in fact, that's exactly what Tosca did just a few years ago. And the results were sort of surprising, especially if you contrast it with what therapists mostly get in their typical CE fare. So what do therapists want to learn when they're surveyed? The number one thing they say is, I want to know how to have better relationships, because all of us can think of that client that didn't return or that dropped out and didn't let us know that they weren't going to come to the next session, or who sent us a nasty email about our empathic failure in the room. We want to have better relationships with our clients. The second thing on the list is how to better initiate change. So once we're connected, the person's engaged, how do we get them started and get them going? The third was training methods that actually improve their outcomes. That's an interesting thought. They don't want to just be trained in methods. They want evidence actually that learning a particular method will improve their outcomes. And last but not least, and central to the process of deliberate practice, which we're going to talk about, is how to use reflection and self-analysis to improve their effectiveness. So how can therapists develop then? This is what they want to do. How can therapists develop? And when we first started addressing this topic, this was back in about 2003 or 2004, and we were struggling with a very curious phenomenon. That phenomenon was when we were measuring the outcomes of practitioners and then looking at the effectiveness of those practitioners, some of them consistently rose to the top in terms of effectiveness, being as much as a standard deviation more effective than everyone else in the sample. Over time, That difference in outcome for that therapist translated into helping hundreds and hundreds more people than average therapists. But when we tried to take that apart and understand what they were doing, when we watched their videotapes of their work, trying to see how did they manage to help more people, we were failing to understand or unlock the mystery. Why were some therapists more effective than others? Just so happened, I was in a plane, came across a magazine that I had never read in my life. I'll tell you what the title of it was, Fortune magazine. Now you know why me, a therapist, had never read that magazine. And there was an article in there about this man I mentioned earlier, K. Anders Ericsson. He is a psychologist, originally from Sweden, who spent the last 40 years of his life studying excellence and expertise, not in psychotherapy. In fact, he'd never been contacted by a therapist, a mental health professional, until our team reached out about 2003, 2004. Instead, he'd been studying chess players, business executives, history teachers, computer programmers, and the lot, athletes as well. His question was, why do some get better when most people remain average over the course of their careers? And when I contacted him and told him after I'd read this article that I thought what his work was saying had some answers for us as a field, he told me a story that I'm sure you may have heard before. It's actually an old Persian story. There's a man, is usually pictured as on his knees rooting around under a streetlight. When someone comes by, often a cop, and says, "What are you doing down there?" And the man says, "Well, I've lost my keys, or I've lost my change." The cop says, "Well, did you lose them here?" And the man says, "Well, no, I didn't." The cop asks, "Why are you looking here under this streetlight then?" And the man says, "Because the light is better." Our field in trying to understand expertise, according to Ericsson, had been looking where the light was the brightest, not necessarily where it would illuminate the best, the mystery of how to improve your outcomes. Where has our field looked at? Well, you'd have to admit that most of what we've studied as a field has been inside this box, the box we call therapy. That's what we watch in graduate school. Those are the theories we read about. We learn to assess and diagnose the client, and then particular methods supposedly remedial to that specific diagnosis. In fact, that's what we did when we first were trying to unravel the mystery of these top performing clinicians. We asked them to send us videotapes, and then we watched them work. I have to tell you, a lot of what we saw from these top performers didn't adhere to any particular theory and seemed at times to be disorganized and even bad quality work according to some internal standard we all had. We wondered at the time, could that be it? They just do crap therapy and that's the way it works? Anders Ericsson really opened our eyes by pointing out that if you wanted to understand why some therapists were more effective than others, you needed to get outside this box we called therapy, and instead look for what those individuals did before and after they met with their clients. Let me give you an example from golf. And in golf, if you want to become a better golfer, you can try to copy the award-winning player's swing. Many people do that. There's actually $1 million industry of people trying to take videos of top performing winning golfers and then having everybody copy their swing. But Anders Ericsson would argue that that whole idea is crazy. If you want to find out how to, or if you want to become a better golfer, you have to look at what those top performers do before their game and after their game. And Anders Ericsson coined a term that is now in wide use around the world to capture this phenomenon. The term was deliberate practice. Deliberate, an adjective, means done consciously and with intent. Practice was, of course, a noun, and that meant to carry out an activity regularly. A deliberate practice seemed to account for why some performers were better than others. Ericsson defined deliberate practice as the hours a performer spent per week alone seriously engaged in activities related to improving their particular skill. And in therapy, of course, that would be your therapy-related skills. We wrote about this in an article you can get for free on my website called Super Shrinks. Just Google my name and Super Shrinks, and the article, you can get it right from my site. Between 2007 and the next several years, my colleagues and I set to work trying to understand, did deliberate practice play a role in accounting for superior therapists? And my colleague, Daryl Chow, now Dr. Daryl Chow, did his doctoral work on this very phenomenon, looking at a large group of therapists from the UK who had monitored their outcomes. And then once we had the therapist data in the can, we separated them into quartiles, with ranking them from best to worst in the sample. Hold on, I know that sounds terrible. We were simply trying to figure out, first, were there differences between therapists? And as in previous studies, there were, with some more effective than others. We had them fill out a very sophisticated measurement tool called Rapid Practice that had them keep track of everything they engaged in the time when they were outside of the room with their clients. How did they try to improve their performance? We had hundreds of activities they could potentially engage in. We had them rate the cognitive difficulty of those tasks, as well as indicate how much time they spent at them. What did we find? We found that the therapists in the top quartile, that is the most effective therapists in our sample, spent 14 times as much time engaged in deliberate practice activities than the least effective therapists in the sample. Now, here's what's amazing about that. If you ask the least effective and the most effective therapists, how effective are you? If we ask them to rate themselves, in other words, both groups rated themselves equally effective. And yet the top performers helped many, many hundreds more people over the course of their career. On average, the top performers spent 2.5 times more time in deliberate practice activities than the average therapist. So it's not that you're not doing deliberate practice, most of us, but rather those in the top tend to do it more. And that gives them a small performance edge. And that performance edge gives them a big impact over time on their outcomes with their clients. So I'm hoping you're wondering, well, how do we do this? And what exactly do we do in deliberate practice? And so let me give you a warning. Deliberate practice has caught on fire in our field. You're going to be hearing a lot about it. And much of that deliberate practice simply fits deliberate practice into the way we already think about psychotherapy. And much of that means that you're going to see books like Deliberate Practice for CBT Therapists, Deliberate Practice for MFTs, Deliberate Practice for Psychoanalytic Therapists. And this misses the whole point of Anders Ericsson's work. Deliberate practice is not about merely repeating things. Instead, for it to be effective, your practice has to be aimed at the edge of your ability, what Vygotsky called the zone of proximal development. That area where your reliable performance is inconsistent, where you're not doing your best work. In that particular edge, you can identify small errors and you can begin to set objectives for improving your performance. You'll have to plan, rehearse, and then reflect on the success of your efforts to improve right at your performance edge. If instead we're simply practicing generic skills, whatever they might be, it may actually interrupt virtuous cycles in our work. So again, the key is finding where the edge is. We're going to come back to that in a moment. How do you find out your performance edge? If you're simply repeating what you already do well, then you're in the realm of reliable performance. That's when you sit down with a client, you notice the pattern, you take the knowledge out and you apply it in that setting. You recognize, you retrieve, you execute, but repeating things you already know to do well doesn't improve your outcomes as you might expect. Your practice simply makes things permanent. One last area on the arrow here, and we like to call it the ambit of admiration. Now, I have to tell you, when I experience the ambit of admiration, that's whenever I go to a CE workshop and watch a masterful therapist work, especially when they're showing me videos that have been perfectly edited or crafted to make me feel bad about myself. So the ambit of admiration is when you're at one of those workshops and the abilities of the performer appear flawless, magical, and dramatic. Now, the problem with that is you can't possibly learn anything from watching that performer, as we've already said. And if you try to learn, you're going to focus it on areas that are easy to recognize, but likely non-causally related to the outcome. In addition, you have the big chance of risk to yourself or others. The point of showing a video like that is, in fact, it is perfect. It's not something to emulate. It's too far ahead of us. We have to get back to that zone of proximal development and figure out what we need to practice. Finding out the what, that's what most people want to know. What is it I need to work on as an individual therapist? What you're seeing in front of you right now is what we call the pyramid of deliberate practice, the building blocks. It contains multiple items that point us in the direction of better outcomes. But the tip of that point is individualized learning objectives. What is it you need to learn right at your zone of proximal development where your performance begins to be inconsistent? What is it? Well, whatever it is you're going to practice, it has to have certain qualities. Hang with me as I lay them out. The first one is, whatever you're going to practice has to be associated or predictive of outcome and engagement of the client. That's the whole point of this. So if you're practicing something that has very little impact on outcome, then we can't expect it to have much power in terms of influencing our results. That's the second quality, influenceable. If what you try to practice isn't improvable, if you can't influence it, then there really is no reason to practice it. Third, whatever you're going to practice to improve, whatever objective you set for yourself, it's going to have to be aimed at something that is ongoing and recurrent. All of us have situations where we meet clients and a session goes bad. For no good reason, it goes bad. Take a moment. You may be able to think of one in the last week. I certainly can. Something happens and I'm just off my game. You can't deliberately practice that because it's a one-off. It's a random event. The fourth quality about what to practice is it has to be measurable. You have to be able to measure that you're doing it and see its impact. And then last but not least, something we've mentioned already is it has to be specific to your growth edge. Those are the qualities that what you practice have to have in order for it to make a difference in your outcomes. I guess the question is, how do you do that? How can you practice that? What factors do improve outcomes? So let's take a look at those factors that improve outcomes. Researchers have spent the last 40 years identifying factors associated with therapeutic success. And when we step back for that research and look at those factors, here's how they line up. Our shortcomings in psychotherapy can fall into one of about 5 different areas in general. Each of them has different leverage on the outcomes. One is the model and technique that we use. That includes the structure, the explanation, the strategy that we use in the ritual. As you can see, it's the factor with the least leverage on outcome. I'm not telling you not to choose that. I am sort of amazed that that's almost all the kind of training that we get, whether that is tapping on people, moving our fingers, or learning how to do an interpretation. All of those things can be helpful, but once you've been at this for a while, the probability that that is going to have much leverage on your outcomes, as you can see, is pretty small. Belief in the process and expectation of results. This is also a factor that we can have shortfall with. Not just in general, but also tied to specific clients that present. The third item is therapist factors. We can get in the way of our outcomes. Perhaps it has something to do with our lack of reflection or our lack of responsiveness. You've probably, like me, had clients that come in and I have a hard time regulating my emotions when I'm in the room with them. Relationship factors comes in really almost first place. real understanding, empathy, and collaboration. And then the last factor is client factors. You can't control very often who walks through the door. This is the largest influence on outcome. And that means that we're going to have to be able to take advantage of those opportunities that present given the unique qualities and characteristic of the clients, their background, their language, their culture, their worldview, and be able to utilize that in the service of the therapeutic process. So let's think about what we've talked about here. Our outcomes aren't improving. Therapists want to improve. It turns out that what they say they would like to learn fits very nicely with the factors that actually influence treatment outcome. So what do you have to do to improve? First, you have to find out what your performance edge is. And then secondly, you have to look at categorizing that edge on a factor that has some impact on treatment outcome. How are you going to do that? Well, let's just take a look for the time that we have remaining at 2 factors. And remember, there are 5, and we could spend more time looking at all 5 of them, but just as a way of getting you started. Therapist factors are about, as I said, reflective functioning, responsiveness, regulation, and engagement in deliberate practice. I'm hoping and I believe that once we finish this, that you'll be interested in adding more deliberate practice to your day. The other part is client factors. It is, as you can see, the largest portion of the leverage on outcome from the various therapeutic factors. And it includes taking advantage of what the client brings in, utilizing everything about them in the service of change. So how could you do that? How could you become more responsive to the individual client characteristics? Let me tell you about some research by a colleague of mine, Bill Stiles, and his colleague, a person that I've met a number of times over the years, Adam Horvath, who really talked at length during the 80s and 90s about the importance of the therapeutic relationship. Here's what they wrote just a couple of years ago, looking at the very same phenomenon we have been looking at as a team. In their article, they say certain therapists are more effective than others because they are appropriately responsive, providing each client with a different individually tailored treatment. Now, I know that's what we all try to do, but Stiles and Horvath are suggesting something more than that. He's suggesting that we can practice responsiveness, improving our reactions to the individual client, improving how we tailor the services to the individual client. How could you do that? Well, many therapists are using some simple measurement tools. Our team has developed a couple of tools, one called the outcome rating scale, that's the one on the left, and the session rating scale, the one on the right. The ORS, it measures outcome or progress. The SRS measures the quality of the alliance. Therapists can begin using these scales for free. You can get them on my website. The purpose of using these scales is to foster better engagement on the part of the client by becoming more responsive to the individual qualities of that particular person in the room with you at that moment. The measures are available in about 30 different languages, and as I say, you can get them for free on my website. Does it make a difference to use the tools? Well, let's take a look at some interesting research that's done by a colleague of mine, Jeb Brown. This is the wizard of statistics in our field. And Jeb has been using measures like ours to provide therapists with information about their effectiveness with individual clients. And here's what he found. He had therapists measure their results, and then he provided access to those results to therapists. And then he monitored, hang with me, he monitored how often they looked at the data that was generated. So you dutifully administer the measures, maybe sort of like we fill out a lot of paperwork at the agency we might work at, but then some therapists, as you can see, never looked at the results. That's under the category none. Some of them looked maybe once or twice in a year. Some of them looked once a week, and others looked multiple times per week. That's the bar on the far right. Well, look at the caption going up the vertical axis. That's gain in effect size. If therapists were looking at the data together with their client, the more often they did that, the better their gain in effect size across all their clients. So much so that therapists who were looking multiple times per week with their clients at the data ended up improving a quarter of a standard deviation in terms of effectiveness. This is just a staggering amount of change. And that means we can improve our outcomes by practicing using the tools and seeking and soliciting feedback from the clients and then adjusting the service to better fit our clients. We call these random errors, meaning that you can't control what comes in the room, but you can certainly respond to what comes in the room in a more effective way. And when we do that, become more appropriately responsive, then we can end up with better outcomes. Why? Because again, we're practicing two factors that have a generous impact on treatment outcome. There's also a whole nother area of deliberate practice that is not aimed at these random errors, whoever walks in the room, but is looking at improving our outcomes around errors that we might make over and over again. Not surprisingly, we call these non-random errors. And once you begin using a set of measurement tools, you would be able to calculate a whole host of metrics about your performance. And with my help or with the help of other people on the ICCE, looking through your data, be able to get a picture of what skills you might need to work on. Let me just give you a hint at this particular graph, pointing out some numbers that are right here. This particular clinician has gathered data on about 170 clients, if we add these two things together here. And their SRS scores, their session rating scale scores at the first session are 38.2 out of 40 points. If your initial thought is, wow, that's really pretty good, let me challenge you a bit, because actually our research shows that therapists who manage to get clients to complain, even in a small way, in the beginning of therapy, and then their scores improve over time on the session rating scale. In other words, the client feels safe at saying to the therapist, that's not exactly what I wanted. You can hear responsiveness in this as well, have better outcomes. So this particular therapist, as you can see, has a fairly high SRS score. This we would call a non-random error. Something in the way the therapist is acting with the client is preventing that client, or on average, it's preventing clients from providing the kind of feedback that might help the therapist tailor the service better to that particular individual therapist. And this is just a start. This is just a small taste of how the tools could be used to identify your particular performance edge. As I said, there are 5 other factors that we can use to target an individual's performance and to understand where they might devote their deliberate practice time. At this point, I think I've given you a run for your money in terms of lots of information about how you might get started with deliberate practice. And perhaps this might be a good point to stop for a moment, talk with John, see if there are any questions about what I've talked about so far.
Okay, so, Scott, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, so I had one question was they just wanted to see if you could give the name of the study that you talked to again. And then I'm going to unmute everybody so that they can have an opportunity to ask questions independently.
And which study was that? Do you remember?
I don't. But you know what? I'm going to unmute and maybe Saber, someone else can remember. Oh, Super Shrink.
The Super Shrink study. So the initial study, the initial article, I should say, where we reviewed the research that had already been done on expertise by Anders Ericsson, and then we applied it to the field of psychotherapy. That's 2007. It's called Super Shrinks, and it's available on my website. The other study was a study by my colleague and I, Daryl Chow, that came out in 2015 called The Role of Deliberate Practice in the Development of Highly Effective Psychotherapists. And again, if you just Google Daryl Chow, Role of Deliberate Practice, then you'll find a link, I'm sure, to that article on my website. And that appeared in the journal Psychotherapy. Were there other questions we should address?
Hi, Scott. Can you hear me?
I can.
Hi. I was just curious. Can you give us an example of a way that you were able to apply this information, this knowledge to your own practice, to your own experiences?
Sure. Let me give you an example about the SRS. Most of the time when people first start using the SRS, their clients give them perfect scores, meaning they get 40s. The clients don't provide any feedback. And I experienced this myself as well, that I got lots and lots of 40s. And then I met a person, her name is Wendy Amy. Wendy Amy is our super shrink #1. She remained unidentified for many, many years. And then we asked if we could interview her. If you've seen me do a presentation before, I show some snippets from the interviews with her. And it was an eye opener because Wendy's outcomes were about a standard deviation better than mine. And let me just say, I love Wendy Amy, but she never struck me as some super therapist. You know, she didn't have a tweed jacket and a pipe. She just was kind of, it seemed almost disorganized. But I'll tell you what Wendy did. She managed to get clients to speak up and speak out about how she could do therapy better. And it was about the way she introduced the measure. So I would go in the room and I would hand the form to the client. I would say, it's a lot like taking the temperature of the visit, and any feedback, I'm appreciative. And then I would often turn to the side and busy myself with activities while they filled out the form. If the scores were on the high side, 36, 37, 38, I took the form, I put it in my file, and I said nothing about it. Wendy was so different. She opened up a whole different avenue to administering the form. She literally begged the clients to give her negative feedback. And when they didn't, she said, there must be something small. Think of it like this, even something that you might think is irrelevant. I'd rather know it, and we sort of address it right now than to just let it go by. If it's nothing, then it will be nothing. So having first seen her do this, I tried to go back in the room and model myself after her behavior, but I still didn't get feedback. I think in part because I was copying exactly what Wendy said rather than trying to understand the principles behind what she was doing. One of those principles were absolute humility. The second one was dependence on the client for direction. And she embodied those things in specific ways. I had to practice embodying those same principles in a way congruent with who I was. Does that make any sense?
Yes, absolutely.
And I think it can be just a huge amount just to begin using and establishing your baseline. You know, if somebody's coming over to your house for a party and they call you and they say, hey, we're a little lost, we can't find your place. The first thing you're going to say is, well, where are you? The where are you question isn't a question we ask in our field. We don't ask, well, how effective are you and when are you not? Instead, we go based on our impressions or our supervisor's impressions. So the measures give us an independent way to assess our performance and begin to look for where does our performance fall short. And you may find that it's with a group of people, maybe kids versus adults, maybe people with a particular issue or concern, depressed versus anxious clients. I have to get that baseline performance before I'm able to set individualized objectives to help me craft my deliberate practice exercises.
Scott, so Elizabeth Lyons said that some treatment protocols are so paperwork heavy, such as EMDR. How does one reconcile giving the client yet another form, such as ORS and SRS?
Yeah, and you know, for me, the ORS and SRS are simply a way to monitor the effectiveness of what I do. I'm hopefully I'm not trying to convince you to do feedback informed treatment, but more to have a baseline against which you assess your performance. I don't know how you get better. It's one of the reasons why athletes have been able to improve steadily. The goalposts aren't shifting, they're set. It's the 100-meter run, whether you are in Hawaii or in Chicago. So we need that same sort of standard across different treatments. I will say this, however, who cares about the protocol if it doesn't work? And in order for it to work, we have to see, does it have an impact on things that the clients value? And clients indicate that their well-being is one of the better predictors of when they start therapy and when they say they've had enough therapy. And that's essentially what the ORS administers. So generally the ORS and SRS or any outcome tool rides above whatever treatment protocol you're using. You're free to use whatever you want in the process. And both of these tools have been automated. You can use a computer program as well to administer them. But again, treating blood pressure, I have to first measure to figure out, do you need that particular treatment? And then I have to also know, is my particular way of treating it actually effective, not only in general, but for this particular person? So I would say measurement has to be part of it. Thanks, Elizabeth.
She says, right on. Okay. So Lee Lord had asked, is there a correlation and is it positive or negative between the scores of the ORS and SRS? What does it mean?
There is a correlation over time between the ORS and SRS. So improving SRS scores are correlated with better outcomes. There are other correlations as well. A single point decrease on the SRS is associated with declines on the ORS 1 to 3 weeks later. Let me say that again. A single point decline. So let's say you have a client who scored at their last visit a 38, but that is down from the prior session of 39. Is that a concern? It doesn't seem like much movement really, but our data show that a single point decline is associated with declines on the ORS 1 to 3 weeks later. And so when this happens, and in the room with me, I'll bring it up. And let me tell you what most clients say. Really? Well, hey, 1 point is not that much. And I say, well, we've just learned from the data that it's important to think this through, because oftentimes 1 to 3 weeks later, the ORSs take a downward turn as well. So my question to you is, can you think of anything that might cause a downward trend in the coming 3 weeks in how you're feeling about your progress? Can you anticipate anything? If they say no, I say perfectly fine. If it does begin to happen, please call, please send me an email. Let's take care of that. And if it doesn't happen, well then good for you. Are there additional questions?
Is there any data that takes into account telehealth?
This is a great question. So everybody's doing telehealth right now. So let me give you a couple of resources, and I feel bad that I didn't mention this. If you go to my blog at scottdmiller.com, the last 4 blog posts have all been about COVID-related treatment issues. And in there are lots and lots of videos that members of the ICC community have provided for how to transition into the telehealth format. There aren't any real good studies indicating that psychotherapy delivered by telehealth is better or worse than face-to-face work. Then again, there aren't any studies that really show one-on-one therapy is better than computer-driven therapy. When you see averages like this, they're easily misinterpreted. All this means is that people need to have choice. So if you find out that individual is as good as telehealth, that doesn't mean everybody should be moved to telehealth, because then we don't have to maintain an office. What it means when the outcomes are equal is people can be given the choice. And I hope that makes sense. What we do know is that electronic applications, mental health applications, are very popular from the Google or the Apple Store. People download them and they are rarely, if ever, used unless there's a human element to them. In other words, there's an interaction with a real life person. So my guess is that once we do have data, and real clear data, that it's going to indicate that your role in the process is central, that the alliance that you form with people, the relationship and the responsiveness is essential and critical, and that in general there's not much difference. But that's just a guess, because our data is really very limited.
I have a question. I was wondering, how the initial outcomes were gathered that showed that slow decline over time?
So that particular study is a study that was done at a large public mental health agency in Calgary, Canada. And the therapists were followed, as I said, 17 years. Each session with a client, the client filled out a standardized measurement tool called the OQ45. And that measure was administered at every single session over the course of treatment and across clients and across years by therapists. It's a great question, actually. And there's sort of two, and then I'll let you all go. There's sort of two general trends in our field when it comes to outcomes. One is decrease in symptoms. This is the traditional way of thinking. And then one is improvements in well-being. Both have been done using self-help measures, using external judges, using therapists as judges over the history of the field. There's a difference, though, that I think is important. Well-being tends to predict better than symptoms, either their experience or their lack of experience of symptoms, of people entering therapy and exiting therapy. In other words, people can have symptoms, but they don't go to therapists until it affects their well-being, if you know what I mean. And once their well-being begins to improve, that's when you start to see some drop-off in terms of people's willingness to attend more therapy. Hey, I've really appreciated the opportunity to speak with all of you this last hour. I hope and pray that you and your family and your colleagues are healthy and safe. Good luck with this new work in telehealth and delivering great services to people of the islands. And thank you once again to the Hawaii Association of Marriage and Family Therapy for allowing me to interact with all of you.
Scott, thank you so much. I just want to shout out to your, if anyone has any additional questions, Scott and his colleagues are offering free feedback-informed treatment meetings ongoing for now. And then I'm sure there's access or additional information on your website about that.
Perfect.
Okay. Aloha, Scott. Mahalo.
Okay, thank you.
Aloha, mahalo.
Aloha.